Hello, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb, and today I would like to focus on the Cold War and more specifically on the nature of the Cold War. I'd like to start off with a little historiography. John Mason, in his book, The Cold War, 1945-1991, he had a few thoughts on the nature of the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of intense antagonism between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, lasting from 1945 to 1991. Because there was no direct armed conflict between the two continental giants, the description Cold War remains an accurate one. Now that it's over, we know the outcome. It is tempting to redefine this period as a recent history as the long peace. Now, he does raise several more complicated issues in this quote. His definition of the main characteristics of the Cold War, the actual starting date. We could perhaps say that the Cold War started in the Second World War as tension between the wartime alliances is occurring, and the meaning of the term superpower. And so when you also look at the ending of that quote where he talks about a long peace, can the period be viewed as a period of long peace? It may be applicable to the United States, the Soviet Union, and some of the European countries. However, wars did wage during this time period on the continents of Asia, Africa, and in the Americas. And so the long peace may not necessarily be accurate. Now, when we look at the concerns after World War II, the Soviet Union had a number of concerns. They were concerned about economic justice. They always reference wars were started by capitalism and the inequities. So they are concerned about economic justice and what lack of it, what it might contribute to perhaps future conflicts. The security on the Western border is something that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union is very focused on. They thought with the Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact that there was security there, but Germany does invade the Soviet Union and so catches them off guard. And so that security on the Western border is going to be very critical. And so that's why Eastern Europe is going to be converted into satellite states. And the balance of military power, concerned about the growth of the United States and the influence that the United States was gaining in the Second World War, and the atomic blackmail. The United States has the atomic weapon, and the Soviets would like to have access to it, but the United States had some contingencies with it, so they're concerned about how it's being used, and it will become atomic diplomacy. For the United States, we do have some concerns as well, and what we would like to do is see a restructure of the former Axis powers, and that is primarily Germany and Japan. Italy is in there as well, but as the war comes to an end, Italy actually becomes an ally of the United States and the Grand Alliance. And so the restructuring of the Axis powers in Germany and Japan, looking at the political and the economic systems there. Free access to resources and markets, that is our primary motive. Free choice of government, so it's highlighting perhaps our preference for the style of governments that we would like to see exist, more democratic in nature. The atomic forces for peace, understanding that atomic weapons in some ways can become a deterrent and can be used as a way to secure outcomes. And limited territorial changes. If the idea of limiting the amount of changes territorial-wise, it could perhaps avoid some conflicts down the road. Now, so much about this Cold War is a clash of ideologies. And so with that, it can come down to some basic components. For the United States, we are looking at capitalism and democracy as the main vehicle to direct us after the Second World War. And so capitalism, when we speak of capitalism, we speak of a market economy, and individual political rights would secure a good standard of living. That is what we thought. A good standard of living is going to come out of a more capitalist system. And so during the Cold War, our goal is to contain and perhaps roll back communism for world peace. Those will be some of our guiding principles there. When we look at reality check, is the ideals of capitalism were met to a greater or lesser extent in most states in what we call the developed world, like the United States. However, that was not necessarily going to be the case in those developing worlds that had capitalist or market economies. Their experience hadn't been always the greatest experience. With that. Developing worlds tend to have the dictatorships or corrupt political systems with little individual rights. Sometimes violence was used to install those regimes. So, in reality, capitalism may work in what we call already developed countries, but in those developing countries, it will be a work in progress. And so when we look at the Soviet Union, their system, communism, and remember there is a political version of communism and an economic version of it. The Soviet Union tried to bring a political form to an economic idea here. For communist countries like the Soviet Union, they view that capitalist competition led to periodic economic crises and wars. And they point out the First and the Second World War as examples of that. Communist revolutions as the only hope for world peace and a good standard of living. So creating a more equitable society is going to be the path towards peace and good standard of living. Again, the reality check is that the Soviet Union developed into a single-party state in both theory and practice with Stalin's form of Marxist-Leninism. Industries were state-owned and run by state bureaucrats. So citizens and workers had very little say in regards to investment, work rates, and or priorities. The Soviet Union also simply just ignored the accomplishments of the West. All right, so this represents our basic ideas, the clash of ideologies that will form and evolve, develop throughout the Cold War. Now, add in clash of Cold War personalities. We do know that world leaders can have an impact on the Cold War. And so if we look at the United States and the Soviet Union, perfect examples of that. And then you have some regional leaders emerging that can add some more layers to the clash of Cold War personalities. You know, for the United States, if we look at the Cold War, it starts with Truman and really ends with George Herbert Walker Bush. And in between, you have Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. And so some of these presidents are Republicans, some of them are Democrats. They all, in some ways, want to show their Cold War credentials there. Some bring a liberal perspective, some bring a conservative perspective. The foreign policies, in many ways, build on this idea of containment and challenging the Soviet Union. The agendas, though, in the foreign policies are tweaked, though, with these personalities, and they're heavily influenced by either the Secretary of State or the State Department. And so you can see some subtle changes to our Cold War policies as we move from administration to administration. and a lot of it's based on what they considered their foreign policy's priorities. Now, for the Soviet Union, the complex Soviet leaders here, Stalin is right there at the beginning, and Gorbachev is there at the end. And so you have Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev. And, they are looking at the Soviet Union as a global leader, and their views in many ways are an extension of perhaps Lenin's ideas of a world revolution. You could claim that Stalin perhaps is not interested in world revolution, but Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev, in some ways, they do have a foreign policy that is looking to expand the influence of the Soviet Union. And so that speaks to kind of like the level of control and influence that they might have on satellite states or client states. And then you have the emerging regional leaders like Mao and Tito, Castro, Nasser. All of them have the ability to project power and want to try to influence the Cold War in terms of on their terms, in that they're trying to, in some ways, non-align with either the United States or the Soviet Union. They are looking out for their own interests. Okay. Now, further, when we see how does this play out, there are a number of areas in which the Cold War finds itself playing out. And so when we look at the United Nations was supposed to be this place where nations come together and solve issues. And it's supposed to be impartial. But during the Cold War, the United Nations definitely will be broken down into a number of camps, the United States camp and the Soviet Union camp. And on that Security Council, the United States and the Soviet Union have the ability to veto measures by the United Nations. And so in some ways, the United Nations isn't able to fully function properly because of the superpower rivalry. Now, I already mentioned a little bit in the previous slide about regional leaders here in trying to be non-aligned. Many of them were part of an organization known as the Non-Alignment Movement, where they are attempting not to get involved in the disputes between the Soviets and the United States. Instead, try to be neutral here. Try to avoid a new form of imperialism. And so at times, depending on the nature of the leader, some of them can do that effectively, and others will struggle and find themselves being caught up in Cold War crises. Of course, aid here, financial and technical aid, is going to be extended out to countries, especially into the developing nations. And with that aid might come strings attached to it, allows for greater influence, either by the Soviets or by the United States. Of course, cultural and sporting competitions both need to be the best in every area, whether it's playing chess or hockey or in the arts, whatever it might be. Both definitely want to show that they were the best. And then the arms and the space race as well, massive buildups of nuclear warheads, atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, ICBMs, SLBMs, ABMs, MIRVs, all that. The nuclear weapons, the capability of them got stronger, and so it was a race there, and of course also for space as well. Getting influence in outer space and perhaps using that as a way to spy on your opponent, or maybe even deliver nuclear strikes that way. So it does play out in the weapons world as well as in the space race world here. And then spies and lies as well. We need to get a cutting edge on our opponent, whether the Soviets or the United States. They will be engaging in espionage to find out what the other side is doing here. The United States, we're always trying to avoid another Pearl Harbor, so that's going to be our justification for our U-2 spy plane missions that will occur throughout the 50s and the 60s here. And then it plays out also in the general public, in which the fear of the Cold War becomes part of our daily life. And to a point where we might become suspicious of our neighbors and actions that might be going on. And in schools, engaging in duck and cover drills, governments putting together civil defense plans. But this war does play out on a number of fronts here, number of arenas, and it will find itself into our own house. All right. And so when we look at the Cold War, there are a number of stages to the Cold War, and we will look at how this Cold War plays out from 1945 to 1941.